Late one rainy evening at St. Mary's Hospital, the night shift had just begun. The dim lights in the long, sterile corridors flickered as the sound of distant thunder rumbled outside. Nurse Emily Bennett checked the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight, and the halls were unusually quiet, save for the steady beeping of machines and the occasional murmur from a patient's room. Emily had been working night shifts for almost 2 years now, and she thought she had seen it all. But tonight felt different. There was an uneasiness in the air, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. As she made her way to the nurse's station, she noticed Sarah, a newer nurse, whispering with Mark, one of the orderlies. They both looked pale, and their eyes kept darting toward the end of the hallway where room 313 sat. Room 313 had been locked for years. It was an old patient room, tucked away in the far corner of the hospital, right beside the storage area. The hospital claimed it was no longer in use due to plumbing issues and outdated equipment. But everyone who worked nights at St. Mary's knew the real reason no one went near it. They said room 313 was haunted. Before we dive, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And while you're here, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe so you never miss a story that will leave you speechless. Now let's get into it. The story went back nearly a decade. A man named Thomas Gray had been admitted to the hospital with severe injuries from a car accident. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, Thomas didn't survive. His death wasn't what unsettled the staff. It was the way he died. Witnesses said Thomas spent his final hours screaming about shadows in the room and figures watching him from the corners. He pleaded with the nurses to keep the lights on, but just moments after they dimmed them, he was found lifeless in his bed, his face frozen in terror. After that night, strange occurrences plagued room 313. Whispered voice, cold drafts, and flickering lights. Eventually, the hospital decided it was better to lock it up and forget it ever existed. Emily always thought it was just a story to scare the new hires, but now, seeing Sarah and Mark's frightened expressions, she wasn't so sure. "What's going on?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sarah leaned in closer. "Did you hear what happened during last night's shift?" Emily shook her head. "Julie said she heard footsteps coming from room 314, heavy ones, and when she walked by, she swore she heard someone whisper her name." Mark added, "And the lights, they kept flickering near the door, but nowhere else on the floor." Emily forced a laugh. "Come on, guys, it's just an old room, probably some electrical issue." But deep down, she felt the same chill they did. Hours passed, and the night dragged on. The hospital felt like it was holding its breath. At around 3 a.m., Emily decided to make her rounds. Most of the patients were asleep, and the halls were nearly silent. As she walked past room 313, she felt an icy breeze sweep through the corridor. She paused. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something older, like dust and decay. Then she heard it, a soft tapping sound from inside the room. Emily stared at the door, her heart pounding. She knew the room was locked. She told herself it was nothing, but the urge to check overwhelmed her. Slowly, she reached for the handle. To her surprise, the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark. The moonlight from the window barely illuminated the dusty bed and the old, broken equipment scattered around. Emily stepped inside, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "Hello?" she whispered. Silence. She turned to leave, telling herself she was just being paranoid. But then, from behind her, she heard a voice. "Help me!" Emily spun around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. There was no one there. She bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Back at the nurse's station, she tried to shake it off. Maybe it was her mind playing tricks on her. Lack of sleep, stress, it all added up. But over the next few nights, things only got worse. Sarah reported seeing shadows move in the hallway. Mark said he heard breathing when he was alone. The entire night shift was on edge. Some staff even started calling in sick to avoid working the nights. One evening, desperate for answers, Emily decided to dig into the hospital's archives. She spent her break in the dusty basement, going through old patient files and incident reports. That's when she found it, Thomas Gray's file. According to the notes, Thomas wasn't just any patient. He had been in a coma for 2 weeks before suddenly waking up, screaming about the man in the corner. The nurses thought it was just delirium, but Thomas insisted he was being watched. He said that every night the man would come closer. On the night of his death, Thomas had scribbled something on a piece of paper. "He's waiting for the next one." Emily felt her blood run cold. What if the haunting wasn't just residual energy? What if Thomas had been warning them all along? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Emily proposed staying in room 313 overnight. Sarah and Mark thought she was crazy, but she convinced them it was the only way to prove whether the stories were true or just hospital folklore. The following night, armed with flashlights, a thermos of coffee, and an old recorder, Emily set up in room 313. Sarah and Mark waited outside, promising to check in every hour. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. Emily sat on the edge of the old bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the building settling. But then, just past 2 a.m., things started happening. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that Emily could see her breath. The recorder picked up faint whispers, unintelligible at first, but then clearer. "Leave now," Emily asked aloud. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The whisper came again. "Waiting, waiting." Suddenly the door slammed shut on its own. The lights flickered violently. Emily tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her as she pounded on the door, calling for Sarah and Mark. Then, in the corner of the room, the shadows shifted. A figure emerged. It looked like a man, but his features were blurred as if the darkness itself clung to him. He pointed at Emily and whispered, "Next." Emily felt an overwhelming force push her back against the wall. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The door flew open and Sarah and Mark rushed in, finding Emily pale and shaking on the floor. They helped her out of the room, and from that night on, room 313 was sealed for good, with strict orders that no one was ever to enter again. Word spread through the hospital. Some believed Emily had finally encountered the ghost of Thomas Gray. Others thought it was just exhaustion, playing tricks on her mind. But Emily knew what she saw. And every night as she passed the end of the hallway, she could still feel the eyes watching her from behind the door of room 313. The legend of the haunted room lived on, whispered from one new nurse to another. Some called it superstition. Others swore it was real. But no one, not even the bravest, ever dared to spend the night there again. And somewhere in the dark behind that locked door, the shadow waited, patiently, for the next visitor. As the days turned into weeks, the hospital staff tried to move on from the incident. Room 313 remained locked, and the key was kept in the administrator's office, far from the reach of curious hands. But the unease lingered. The night shift nurses began to notice strange occurrences even outside of room 313. Equipment would malfunction without explanation, patient monitors would go off without cause, and the temperature in certain areas of the hospital would drop inexplicably. Emily, still shaken from her experience, found herself increasingly on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, even when she was far from room 313. She started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, where she was back in the room, the shadowy figure looming closer each night. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, the whispers from her dreams echoing in her ears. One night, as Emily was finishing her rounds, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the end of the hallway. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was unmistakable. It was coming from room 313. She glanced around, hoping to see Sarah or Mark, but the corridor was empty. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding her attention. Against her better judgment, Emily found herself walking toward the room. Her footsteps echoed in the silent hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she approached the door, the tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. She stood there, her hand hovering over the doorknob, her mind screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. She turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was just as she had left it, dark, dusty, and filled with broken equipment. The air was cold, and the faint smell of decay lingered. Emily stepped inside, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. She scanned the room, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response. She was about to leave when she noticed something on the floor near the bed. It was a piece of paper, crumpled and yellowed with age. She picked it up and unfolded it, her hands shaking. The writing was barely legible, but she could make out the words, "He's still here." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the paper and backed away, her mind racing. She had to get out of there. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The room plunged into darkness as her flashlight flickered and died. She fumbled with the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and she could see her breath forming clouds in front of her. The whispers started again, faint at first, but growing louder, more urgent. "Leave now!" Emily spun around, her back pressed against the door. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, shifting and swirling around her. She could feel a presence, something dark and malevolent, closing in on her. "Who are you?" she cried out, her voice breaking. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were almost deafening. Emily covered her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The shadows coalesced into a figure, the same one she had seen before. It loomed over her, its features still blurred, but its eyes, dark and hollow, pierced through her. "Next," it whispered, its voice cold and devoid of emotion. Emily felt a force push her against the door, pinning her in place. She struggled to breathe, her vision blurring as the figure leaned in closer. She could feel its breath, cold and rancid, on her face. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room was silent once more, the only sound the faint hum of the hospital's machinery. Emily slumped to the floor, gasping for air. The door creaked open, and Sarah and Mark rushed in, their faces pale with fear. "Emily, are you okay?" Sarah asked, helping her to her feet. Emily nodded, but she couldn't speak. She was too shaken, too terrified to form words. They helped her out of the room, and she collapsed into a chair at the nurse's station, her hands trembling. From that night on, Emily refused to go near room 313. She requested a transfer to the day shift, hoping to escape the nightmares and the whispers that haunted her every waking moment. But no matter how far she tried to run, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was still watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The legend of room 313 grew, spreading beyond the hospital walls. People came from far and wide, hoping to catch a glimpse of the haunted room. Some claimed to have seen the shadowy figure in the window. Others said they heard the whispers echoing through the halls. But no one dared to enter the room, not after what had happened to Emily. And so, the shadow waited, biding its time, knowing that sooner or later, someone would be foolish enough to open the door again. And when they did, it would be ready. As the months passed, the hospital administration decided to take drastic measures. They couldn't afford to have their staff and patients living in fear, and the rumors were starting to affect the hospital's reputation. They hired a team of paranormal investigators to examine room 313 and determine once and for all if the room was truly haunted. The investigators arrived on a cold, rainy night, much like the one when Emily had first encountered the shadow. They set up their equipment in the hallway outside room 313, their cameras and sensors trained on the door. The staff watched from a distance, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. The lead investigator, a man named Dr. James Carter, approached the door with a sense of determination. He had dealt with countless haunted locations before, and he wasn't about to let a little fear stop him. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, stepping inside with his team close behind. The room was just as Emily had described, dark, dusty, and filled with broken equipment. The air was cold, and the faint smell of decay lingered. Dr. Carter scanned the room with his flashlight, his eyes narrowing as he took in the details. "Let's set up here," he said, pointing to the center of the room. The team got to work, setting up their equipment and preparing for the investigation. They placed cameras in each corner of the room, set up audio recorders to capture any whispers or voices, and positioned temperature sensors to monitor any sudden drops. As they worked, the room grew colder. The temperature sensors began to beep, indicating a rapid drop in temperature. Dr. Carter glanced at the readings, his brow furrowing. "This is unusual," he muttered, more to himself than to his team. The whispers started soon after, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing minute. The audio recorders picked up the voices, but they were too distorted to make out any words. The cameras captured shadows moving across the walls, but there was no visible source of light to cast them. Dr. Carter tried to remain calm, but even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that filled the room. He turned to his team, his voice steady but firm. "Let's try to communicate with whatever is here," he said. He pulled out a digital voice recorder and held it up, his eyes scanning the room. "Is there anyone here with us?" he asked, his voice echoing in the silence. At first there was no response, but then the whispers grew louder, more urgent. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows began to swirl around the room. The cameras captured the figure emerging from the darkness, its features blurred and indistinct. Dr. Carter's eyes widened as he saw the figure on the monitor. He turned to his team, his voice urgent. "We need to get out of here, now." But it was too late. The door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers grew deafening, and the figure loomed over them, its hollow eyes staring into their souls. "Next," it whispered, its voice cold and emotionless. The team tried to escape, but the door wouldn't budge. They pounded on it, screaming for help, but no one came. The figure closed in on them, its presence overwhelming. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was silent once more, the only sound the faint hum of the hospital's machinery. The door creaked open, and the team stumbled out, their face pale with fear. Dr. Carter was the last to leave, his hands trembling as he closed the door behind him. He turned to his team, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're sealing this room. No one goes in there again." The team nodded, their faces grim. They packed up their equipment and left the hospital, never to return. The next day, the hospital administration made the decision to permanently seal room 313. They reinforced the door with steel bars and placed a warning sign on it, forbidding anyone from entering. The staff breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the unease remained. Emily, now working the day shift, still felt the shadows were in, even though she was far from the room. She knew it was only a matter of time before someone else would be foolish enough to open the door. And when they did, the shadow would be waiting. Years passed, and the legend of room 313 became a cautionary tale, whispered among the new staff members. The room remained sealed, its secrets locked away behind the steel bars. But the shadow never left. It lingered in the darkness, waiting patiently for the next visitor. As the whispers of room 313 fade into the shadows and the chilling tale of St. Mary's Hospital lingers in your mind, we hope this story sent shivers down your spine and kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed this dramatic journey into the unknown, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling story from this channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring more gripping tales like this one to life. Thank you for watching. And remember, some doors are better left closed, but the door to more suspenseful stories is always open here. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling adventures. See you in the next video.